The fog hung low over the German countryside, thick enough to blur the trees into pale silhouettes and swallow the narrow dirt roads that snaked between them. The early morning air tasted like cold iron. Wet leaves glistened beneath a thin layer of dew. Birds were silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of morning where sound traveled too far, too clearly, making every snapped twig feel like a bullet fired in the dark. Private First Class William Carter crouched beside a moss-covered stone wall and adjusted the strap of his field pack. He had been awake for hours, long before the sun began its slow rise behind the hills, and now that faint grey light crept across the horizon like an approaching ghost. Carter didn't like daylight, not on mornings like this. Light made him visible. Light erased shadows. Light took away the only advantage a lone scout had, being unseen. And he was alone. Not because his unit abandoned him, not because he fell behind, not because he got lost. Carter was alone because command sent him ahead, far ahead, to confirm German troop positions near a small village that intelligence officers couldn't agree on. One report said the Germans abandoned it. Another said it was held by a few stragglers. Another, worryingly, suggested the Germans had reinforced it overnight. Carter didn't rely on reports. He relied on what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. And right now, everything in the air told him the Germans were still here. The forest was too quiet, the fog too heavy, the road devoid of even a single animal track. It was the unnatural silence of a place waiting for something. He tightened his grip on his M1 carbine. The wood was cold against his palm. He moved along the wall slowly, his boots making almost no sound on the damp ground. A good scout learned to step with intention, to treat every leaf like a landmine that could give away his position. He stopped, listened. Nothing. Then, a faint metallic clack. Carter froze. It came from ahead, somewhere near the bend in the road. The unmistakable sound of a rifle bolt or a helmet brushing stone. He crouched lower and slid toward the ditch, easing his body into the shallow trench. The mud soaked into his sleeves. He didn't care. The world narrowed to sound and direction. There it was again, clack, soft but real. German. American rifles didn't sound like that. He slowly raised his head above the ditch, just enough to see between the fog and the hedgerow. A silhouette moved. Then another. But they didn't look like a patrol. They weren't moving with the careful rhythm of scouting troops. They were relaxed, walking casually, talking in low voices. Two German soldiers strolled down the road, carrying mess tins and rifles slung lazily across their shoulders. Their breath fogged the air as they chatted, oblivious to the American scout watching them barely 30 yards away. Carter didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe deeply. The Germans passed within seconds, footsteps fading into the mist. Carter stayed still for a long moment after, letting the silence settle again. His pulse steadied, his instincts sharpened. If there were Germans casually walking around, that meant something important. The village was occupied, and not just by a handful. Comfortable soldiers meant a confident garrison. He slid out of the ditch and moved deeper into the tree line. The forest here was thick with fir and birch, giving him enough cover to slip between the trunks undetected. He stepped around fallen branches and avoided patches of dry leaves that would betray his presence. The fog clung to him, turning him into another ghost drifting through the woods. A faint shape emerged between the trees. A church spire. Carter squinted. There it was, the village. Nestled in a dip between two hills, its rooftops barely visible through the shifting grey mist. Smoke curled from chimneys. Figures walked near the central square. Even from here he could see German uniforms moving in predictable patterns. Carter knelt behind a log, heart steady, mind alert. One man, one carbine, one set of dog tags, one map. Against what? A platoon, too, a company. He didn't know yet. But he would. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his map. A few pencil marks indicated the expected German defensive positions: trenches on the east, sandbags near the northern entrance, an outpost at the church bell tower. But that was yesterday's intel. Everything in war changed in hours. He needed new eyes, his own eyes. He scanned the outskirts of the village. The fog helped him. It softened edges, muted sounds, hid movement. He slid deeper into the trees until he reached a small rise overlooking a cluster of farmhouses. Movement again. 3 Germans walked between the houses carrying crates, probably ammunition or supplies. Beside them, leaning against a fence, was a mounted MG-42, idle, unmanned, but loaded. Carter whispered under his breath, "That's good." The Germans didn't expect trouble. If they did, that MG-42 wouldn't be sitting there without someone behind it. He watched their pattern. The soldiers disappeared into a barn, left the crate, then returned for another. Over and over, predictable, efficient, careless. Carter observed the nearest house. A window sat open, curtains fluttering. A rifle leaned against the wall beside it. He could get inside. But should he? His mission was reconnaissance, not engagement. But the thought pulled at him. If he took one radio, one map, one prisoner, he might learn everything he needed in minutes. He breathed out slowly. No, not yet. He needed more information. His mind worked like clockwork, quiet, calculating. He slid back into the trees and circled toward the west side of the village, moving with practiced precision. He approached a small slope overlooking the road into town. More silhouettes. 6 Germans stood at the checkpoint, leaning against sandbags, laughing, passing around cigarettes, helmets off, rifles resting casually. One soldier climbed atop a crate and stretched, yawning loudly. Carter's eyes narrowed. Another sign. Relaxed soldiers meant they didn't expect an American unit nearby. Perhaps they thought the front had moved. Perhaps they thought they were safe here. Carter crouched and watched their movements. A truck sat parked next to the checkpoint. Canvas cover, fuel canisters, a radio set in the cab. Carter's heartbeat slowed. A radio truck. That meant communication. That meant command. That meant access. He sank deeper into the brush, mind racing. Then the sound came again. Voices. Closer this time. He turned slowly. 2 Germans walked toward him through the tree line, rifles slung, heading for the checkpoint. Another casual patrol. They were seconds from spotting him. Carter flattened himself into the ground, pressing his body against cold earth, pulling dead leaves over his helmet and shoulders like a camouflage blanket. The Germans approached. Closer. Carter didn't move. A beetle crawled across his hand. He didn't flinch. 1 German stopped. Carter's breath caught. The German bent down, picked up a branch, and threw it aside. Then he stretched aside and kept walking. The 2 soldiers disappeared down the slope. Carter exhaled, quiet, slow, controlled. He scanned the village again. He counted 2 squads moving near the market square, another group reinforcing the southern barn, and one more climbing onto a rooftop guard post. At least 20 German soldiers. Maybe 30. Maybe more. But numbers didn't shake him. Carter had been here before, behind enemy lines, Alone, scouting positions others didn't dare approach. His job wasn't to fight battalions, his job was to read them. And right now, he read something interesting. The Germans weren't preparing for battle. They weren't fortifying. They weren't watching the tree line. They thought they were alone. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. A dangerous assumption, especially with him nearby. He rose slowly and moved deeper along the ridge until he reached an elevated vantage point above the village center. He could see everything now: the town square, the church, the bakery, the inn, the small cluster of supply trucks. He watched the Germans move like pieces on a chessboard, unaware of the lone scout studying them from the shadows. He crouched and marked several notes on his map. Entry points, weak spots, blind angles, escape routes. His pen scratched lightly against the paper. Then he paused. Something caught his eye. A German officer stepped out of the town hall carrying a fold-out map. 2 soldiers followed him, rifles slung. They gathered near the stone fountain in the square. The officer pointed to several positions on the map, speaking with urgency. Carter could barely hear him. Then a breeze shifted. He caught one word: Amerikaner. His jaw clenched. They were expecting a U.S. patrol. But not him. Not a lone scout. Carter didn't move. His eyes traced the movements of the soldiers. The officer barked more orders. German troops formed small clusters across the village, still relaxed but shifting position. They didn't know he was here. They didn't know he was watching. They didn't know he was already planning. He studied the village layout. The German defenses weren't sloppy. They were just routine. Predictable. Carter slid deeper into the brush and followed the ridgeline until he reached a narrow farm track leading toward the back of the village. A low stone wall ran alongside it, partially broken, offering perfect cover. Beyond it sat a small farmhouse with an open door and laundry hanging outside. A perfect blind spot. Carter approached silently, boots brushing the dirt as softly as falling ash. He reached the wall, pressed his back against it, and peeked through a gap in the stones. The farmhouse interior was empty. He slipped inside. The house smelled like bread, mud, and damp wool. A blanket hung half-folded over a chair. The remnants of a meal sat on a table. A German helmet lay on the counter beside a tin cup. Carter crouched near the window. He could see the entire back alley between the farmhouse and the market square. Once again, Germans walked casually, unaware, unthreatened. Carter's mind sharpened. He could hit them. Not recklessly, not with bravado, but surgically. He reached for his carbine, checking the chamber. Klein loaded. He looked at his watch. He had time. Carter inhaled slowly. The village wasn't going to capture itself. Carter stayed inside the farmhouse long enough for his pulse to slow. He had slipped behind enemy lines before, but this village felt different. Too alive, too occupied, too unsuspecting. German soldiers walked between buildings with an ease that only came from believing they were safe. That confidence, dangerous for them, useful for him, was the very thing he needed. He crouched beside the window, keeping his silhouette hidden, and watched the alley behind the farmhouse. A pair of German soldiers wandered near a water barrel, filling canteens. One man joked about something and slapped the other on the back. Their rifles hung loosely at their sides, not a care in the world. Carter observed them quietly. His training told him to avoid unnecessary engagement. His instinct told him something else. If he let these two walk away, they might return later with information, or worse, stumble across him accidentally. He couldn't afford that, not now, not deep behind enemy lines. He moved deeper into the farmhouse and found a small side door leading to the barn. The wood was old, worn from years of seasonal heat and cold, but the latch was functional. Carter eased it open slowly so it wouldn't creak. The barn was dim inside, and the smell of hay and damp wood filled the air. Chickens rustled in a crate in the corner, and a horse shifted in its stall. Carter took a knee behind a stack of hay bales and peered through the cracks between the boards. The Germans were moving away. Now or never. He slipped out quietly and hugged the wall of the farmhouse. His boots padded lightly over the dew-soaked grass. He stayed low, breath-controlled, movements small and precise. When he reached the edge of the building, he paused. The Germans stopped near a small shed, still talking. He could hear parts of their conversation, now mundane things, complaints about cold weather, questions about when breakfast would be ready, nothing that suggested they knew an American was within 30 yards of them. Perfect. Carter gripped his carbine, took a steadying breath and stepped out. One shot. A quick clean. The first soldier dropped instantly. The second reached for his rifle. Carter didn't give him time. A second shot echoed through the fog. Silence returned. The two bodies slumped beside the shed, barely visible from the road. Carter dragged them behind the building swiftly, hiding them beneath a stack of firewood. He checked their pockets, maps, a pack of cigarettes, 2 knives, nothing else. No radio, no notes. These weren't officers, just grunts. He wiped his hands on his fatigues and moved back toward the farmhouse. That was one small corner secured. But the village was still crawling. He returned to the vantage point overlooking the main square. Germans milled about in casual patterns, oblivious to the minor disturbance at the periphery. A cook shouted at a group of soldiers carrying crates. 2 officers chatted near the town hall. A mechanic inspected a motorbike. The MG-42 teams repositioned sandbags lazily, checking angles but not urgently. Carter observed everything, storing each detail like a puzzle piece. Patterns mattered, movement mattered. Weaknesses mattered most. He scanned each building. The bakery had no guards. The butcher shop door hung open, knives visible inside. The church tower gave a perfect view of the entire village, but also exposed anyone inside it. None of those were ideal. Then Carter saw it, a narrow alley between the tailor's shop and a barn. Hardly anyone walked through it. It led directly toward the village center. Unlike other routes, it wasn't muddy from recent boots. Meaning, no one patrolled it. He slid along the farmhouse wall and crossed to a cluster of barrels near a wooden fence. From there, he slipped into the alley. Cobblestones beneath his boots muted his steps. He kept his eyes on every window, every doorway, every rooftop. German helmets glinted in the distance, but none turned toward him. Halfway down the alley, Carter stopped. A voice is closer. He ducked behind a stack of crates. 2 soldiers walked past the entrance of the alley, heading toward the marketplace. They were carrying a folded tarp and arguing about something. Carter waited until they disappeared behind a row of wagons. Then he kept going. At the end of the alley, the village opened again into a courtyard lined with supply crates. A German corporal stood by a table reading a clipboard. His rifle lay against the crate behind him, careless. 2 more soldiers nearby stacked boxes into the back of a truck. Carter watched them. If he moved now, he'd be visible. If he waited, someone else might walk through. He needed a distraction. He scanned the crates. Fuel cans, 3 of them. Carter crouched, picked up a small stone, and tossed it lightly at the nearest fuel canister. It clanged softly against the metal. Instantly, the corporal straightened. Was warders. He motioned for the 2 other soldiers to check the sound. They walked toward the crates. Carter slipped around the opposite side. They didn't see him. He approached the corporal from behind, grabbed him by the collar and pulled him behind the table. His hand clamped over the man's mouth. One swift strike with the edge of his hand knocked him unconscious. He dragged the limp body behind the stacked crates. The others still inspected the fuel cans, confused. Carter returned to the truck. Inside the cab sat a map case. He opened it. Maps, codes, patrol routes, logistics, times, everything he needed. He slid the map case into his pack. Then he noticed something else, a folded German armband with the insignia of a supply runner. Carter's mind worked quickly. If he wore that, he could walk straight through the village. He took it. Footsteps approached. Carter turned. The 2 soldiers returned, still confused, one shrugging, the other laughing at the idea of mice knocking over cans. They were close enough to see everything. Carter moved. His carbine clicked once. 2 fast shots. Both Germans crumpled silently. Carter dragged them behind the crates with the corporal. 3 down. No alarms. He looked across the courtyard toward the town hall. A guard stood outside the door, rifle resting on his shoulder, posture relaxed but vigilant. Carter couldn't engage him from here without revealing his position. He needed something smarter. He scanned the terrain. A cart full of hay sat near the alley. A smoldering coal bucket rested beside the barn. Carter grabbed the bucket. Carefully, quietly. He walked to the cart and dropped a handful of glowing coals into the hay. It smoked instantly. Carter whispered, "Come on." The smoke thickened. A spark. A flame. Within seconds, the cart ignited, slowly, not explosively, but enough to produce a visible plume rising above the houses. The guard noticed first. He shouted something and ran toward the cart. More Germans followed. 4, 6 more. The entire courtyard emptied. Carter slipped from behind the crates and crossed the open space to the town hall door. He pressed his back against it and waited. No footsteps. No voices inside. He opened the door and moved inside. The air was warmer here and smelled of ink, wool, and stale bread. Papers lay scattered on a long table. A typewriter sat near a radio set. A half-eaten sandwich rested beside a stack of reports. Carter walked deeper into the room. He found the radio. It was active. He listened. A position secure, no American activity, supplies arriving by afternoon. He turned the knob to low volume. He didn't need the Germans calling for reinforcements. In the corner, he spotted another item that made his pulse quicken, a wooden crate marked with the symbol for captured Allied equipment. Inside were American items, canteens, jackets, a broken bar, and a US medical kit. The Germans had been taking from nearby skirmishes. He closed the crate quietly. Then, footsteps. Carter slid behind a pillar just as 2 German soldiers entered the hall discussing the fire outside. One approached the table. The other turned toward the radio. Carter breathed shallowly, carbine ready. The soldier at the radio frowned, fiddling with the dials. Carter stepped out silently. One strike. The radio soldier dropped. The second turned too slow. Carter struck him across the jaw and he collapsed. Carter dragged both bodies behind the table. His mind sharpened. He had intel. He had silence. He had positioning. Now he needed opportunity. He moved to the window and scanned the square. The fire brigade scrambled to put out the hay cart blaze. Soldiers shouted orders, chaos blooming around the flames. Carter's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a village anymore. It was a vulnerable system, one that he now understood, and one that he could take apart piece by piece. Not by force, not with numbers, but with precision. He stepped out of the town hall and moved toward the church tower. If he took that tower... Carter moved across the courtyard like a shadow that belonged to no object. Smoke still drifted from the small hay fire he had set, and the German troops were clustered around it, coughing and shouting, their attention broken, their order disrupted. A small distraction, but a meaningful one. That kind of chaos could change the balance of an entire battlefield if applied correctly. He had learned this the hard way during earlier campaigns. Panic was a weapon, confusion was a force multiplier. He slipped into a side street, passing a row of shuttered windows and a wagon filled with bags of flour. The village was waking up, but its rhythm was fractured. Carter heard the distinct scrape of boots hurrying against cobblestone. Orders barked from opposite ends of the square. Something was clearly wrong, but the Germans didn't yet know what. Carter did. He paused and listened. Farther ahead, the church tower loomed above the rooftops. The stones were old, weathered by time and war. Its steeple rose into the fog like a spear piercing the sky. Every village built before the century had a tower like this. What those builders never imagined was how deadly such a structure would become during a modern war. Height meant sight, and sight meant dominance. A lone scout with sight was worth 20 soldiers without it. He approached the church cautiously, hugging the exterior wall, eyes scanning for movement. The heavy double doors were cracked open, and through that narrow slit Carter could see pews, candles, and the faint flicker of lantern light. A German voice drifted from inside, deep, annoyed, half asleep. Carter slipped through the door silently. Inside, the church smelled of dust, wax, and damp stone. The air was still and cool. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows in fractured beams of red, gold, and blue. Carter kept low behind the last row of pews. A German soldier sat near the altar with his helmet beside him and his rifle leaning against the pulpit. He was cleaning his boots, scraping mud from the soles with a knife. He muttered to himself, occasionally glancing toward the windows. Carter didn't hesitate. He grabbed the soldier from behind, placed a hand over his mouth, and knocked him out with a strike so quick the lantern flame didn't flicker. Carter dragged him behind the altar and wedged him between two stone pillars where no one would casually look. He didn't kill unless he had to. Dead bodies raised alarms. Sleeping ones bought time. Carter moved toward the stairwell that led to the bell tower. The wooden door creaked faintly when he pushed it open, and he froze, listening for movement. Nothing. He slipped through and climbed the narrow spiral staircase, feet barely brushing the steps. Dust drifted from the rafters with each step. The air grew colder as he ascended, the walls tightening around him. Halfway up, he heard murmuring. He stopped. Two voices. He moved slower. Near the top, the stairwell opened into the tower's interior room. Two German soldiers sat near the massive bell, cards spread on a crate between them, rifles leaning against the wall. They were arguing about a game, one slamming his palm on the crate in frustration. Carter raised his carbine. But then, a third soldier emerged from behind the bell, stretching his arms and yawning. 3. Carter ducked behind the incomplete stone section of the tower's round wall, peeking through a gap. He couldn't take 3 at once with a rifle. He needed something quieter. His knife. He listened carefully. The soldiers were relaxed, distracted. One shook his head repeatedly, complaining about his losing streak. Another laughed, teasing him. The third rummaged through a ration tin. They weren't alert. Carter slid out of his pack a small, flat stone, smooth, heavy. He tossed it gently across the chamber. It clinked against the opposite wall. The card players paused. One frowned. Was Warders. The third turned. Something fell. The curious one stood and walked toward the sound, leaving his rifle behind. The second followed. Carter waited until the two were a step from the stone. Then he moved. A swift, a silent, a precise. He struck the first soldier at the base of the skull. The man collapsed with a muffled thud. The second barely had time to gasp before Carter disarmed him and delivered another quick strike. Both down. The third soldier froze, ration tin in hand, eyes wide. Carter crossed the room in 3 silent steps. The man opened his mouth to shout. Carter silenced him with a sharp tap to the jaw. All 3 lay motionless beside the bell. Carter checked their pulses, all alive. Then he turned to the windows. The tower offered a perfect view of the village. And the village was a map of opportunity. He studied each street, each courtyard, each cluster of soldiers, watching how they reacted to the fire he set. The Germans weren't trained to expect lone infiltrators behind their lines. Their response wasn't coordinated. One group dragged water buckets, another yelled orders, a third stood idle, unsure where to go. Officers barked commands left and right, and none of them knew the real threat was watching from above. Carter took out his map. He marked new positions. 3 machine gun nests. 1 mortar pit. 6 patrols. But only one officer looked competent, the same one who had been near the fountain. He moved differently, spoke sharply, gestured with authority. His presence centered the chaos. Carter watched him for several minutes. Every German in the square deferred to him. He was the mind of the village. Take him out and the body collapsed. Carter lowered the map and looked toward the far edge of the village. A supply building with a small guard post offered the only direct line to the officer without passing through open ground. Carter descended the tower. He crossed the back of the church and slipped through a small side door into a narrow alley bordered by stacked firewood and a low stone wall. He kept the church between himself and the majority of the Germans. Ahead, 2 soldiers stood near a wagon, conversing quietly. One smoked a cigarette, the other cleaned a bayonet. Carter moved toward them with slow, measured steps, staying behind cover until the moment they both turned away from him. He moved. A swift takedown. 2 more unconscious bodies hidden behind stacked barrels. Carter reached the supply building's rear entrance. A single guard leaned against the doorframe, half asleep. The man's helmet covered his eyes. His rifle rested against his lap. Carter approached silently. The soldier never woke. Inside, the supply building was cluttered with crates, tools, and sacks of grain. A German sergeant knelt by a radio set, adjusting the frequency band. Another sorted through ammunition crates nearby. Carter ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets. He whispered to himself, two inside, one at the front. He needed to clear it quietly. A loose bolt shelved on a nearby work table caught his eye, and beside it a hammer. Carter picked up the bolt, tossed it lightly toward the opposite side of the room. The sergeant paused. Was Warders? He stood and walked toward the noise. Carter circled behind him. One strike. The sergeant collapsed. The second soldier turned, startled. Hey! Carter grabbed him before he could shout and knocked him unconscious. He dragged both to a dark corner and tied their hands with rope from a supply bundle. The building was clear. He moved toward the front door and peeked outside. The courtyard was still chaotic. The officer stood near the fountain, giving new orders. He was confident, commanding, exactly the type who would rally the German troops if they suspected anything more than a small accident. Carter narrowed his eyes. He needed to isolate him. He watched closely. The officer finished giving instructions to a group of soldiers who jogged across the square. Then he turned toward the supply building, perhaps intending to check the crates. Perfect. Carter stepped fully behind the door, gripping the handle with his left hand and his carbine with his right. The officer approached. 20 feet. 15. 10. He reached for the door. Carter pulled it open silently. The officer stepped inside, and Carter struck him hard, grabbing him by the collar and dragging him into the shadows before he could react. The officer struggled for a split second, then Carter's arm locked around his throat. He slumped to the floor unconscious. Carter knelt and checked his pockets. A notebook, a key, a map, and a sealed envelope. He pocketed everything. The officer was deeper than just commanding this village. He was connected to someone higher. Carter hid the officer's body and slipped back out the door. He scanned the square. No one had noticed. He looked toward the barracks near the eastern edge of the village. Inside those barracks he knew were more soldiers and possibly a weapon cache. He didn't need to engage them. He just needed to trap them. Smoke drifted through the village again as the small hay blaze died out. German voices rang out, still unsure, still disorganized. Carter stepped back into the shadows. He had dismantled the village's leadership. Now he would dismantle its ability to fight.